A dying patient's last words dragged me into a bloody mafia war. Marcus Chen bled out in my ER, gripping my wrist and begging me to tell the notorious Dante Varley that the contract still stands. I was just a broke nurse drowning in debt. But delivering that message changed my life forever. Suddenly, I wasn't just saving lives. I was signing my own life away to become a mobster's fake bride.
Step into this chaos with me, right into the freezing heart of an emergency room at midnight. The fluorescent lights hum, and we find Nurse Lena Carter. You can almost feel the bone-deep exhaustion dragging her shoulders down. Suddenly, a bleeding stranger grabs her wrist, his grip like a steel vise. He leaves a terrifying smear of red across her scrubs, begging her to pass a message to Dante Varley. Just hearing that mafia boss name is enough to make the blood run cold. Lena freezes entirely, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She has absolutely no idea she just stepped into a dark psychological trap. Look, it is a hard truth to swallow. But sometimes the most dangerous chapters of our lives only begin because we stop to help a broken stranger. Look closely at her ruined sneakers, telling the story of a girl running on empty. Lena has been grinding through a 14-hour shift, completely burning out. When you spend every second trying to piece broken people back together, that darkness eventually chips away at your own soul. The trauma alarm screams, but she does not even blink. She snaps on fresh gloves as the doors crash open. They rush in a man bleeding out from a gunshot wound. Lena tears away his shredded jacket with desperate hands. No wallet, no name. Just a dying man screaming for the underworld kingpin, Varley. The harsh reality we all must face is that extreme trauma strips away our identity, leaving absolutely nothing behind but our deepest, darkest fears. Through all the deafening chaos, the terrifying weight of that mafia name fades into the background noise. For 20 agonizing minutes, Lena fights tooth-tethered to the world. To keep this stranger tethered to the world. "You are going to make it," she whispers. We all know that heartbreaking lie, the one we tell to soften the brutal edge of death. He is completely panicked, locking his eyes onto hers. He chokes out the name Marcus Chen, his fingers digging into her arm with the strength of a man on the edge of the grave, begging her to warn his family. "I will tell him," she promises, desperate to give him a final moment of peace. At 11:47 p.m., the monitor flatlines. Kindness is a beautiful thing, but in a ruthless world, playing the saint can quickly become a fatal mistake. Notice how the shadows stretch longer here, the tension wrapping around the room like a cold hand. When Lena Nurse whispers that Mabos pale and orders her to forget she ever heard it. Fast forward to 2 in the morning, and Lena pushes open the door to her crumbling apartment. She finds her little brother Danny, wide awake and looking terrifyingly frail. He tries to hide his laptop, but she already spotted the mountain of medical bills for his leukemia treatments. She has sold everything for a battle they are losing. The ultimate heartbreak is watching someone you love suffer while your hands are tied. Danny quietly suggests skipping the hospital bill. It is a brutal reminder that poverty robs us of our choices long before it ever takes our hope. "You and I are going to look closely at this moment. You are going to college, exactly like we planned," she tells him. Her voice is steady, a perfectly constructed mask, hiding a soul that is totally crushed. After a sleepless night, she drags herself back to the hospital, running on raw willpower. But the fragile quiet shatters just 3 hours in. 2 massive men in sharp suits step into the ward, radiating the terrifying energy of men who break bones for a living. They coldly announce that Mr. Varley wants to see her. The entire floor goes dead silent. Every single coworker physically steps back, leaving Lena utterly alone. Here is a tough pill about human nature. When pure danger walks into a room, people will almost always step back to save their own skin. Lena desperately tries to hold her ground, her voice trembling as she cannot abandon her shift. The lead hitman does not even blink, calmly stating her boss already clocked her out. It is a savage psychological tactic, destroying her safety net and leaving her with nowhere to run. She strips off her scrubs, her hands shaking so violently she struggles to tie her shoes. She knows exactly what kind of monster is waiting for her. Yet she forces one foot in front of the other, convincing herself she is merely delivering a dead man's message. Honestly, we all do this. We spin little lies to scrape together an ounce of bravery when our backs are pressed hard against the wall. Taking a deep breath, she steps out into the freezing night, walking toward the black sedan. She slides into the leather seat, and the heavy doors lock with a sickening click, sounding exactly like a prison cell slamming shut. The car descends into a bunker, silent and cold as a tomb. An elevator shoots her upward, spilling her into an immaculate penthouse. The sharp angles and dark shadows reveal a man who completely controls his world. In the center sits the kingpin, Dante Varley. As he turns his wheelchair to face her, Lena braces for a scarred, violent thug. Instead, she finds a man who is quietly elegant, sharply dressed, and completely composed. His chilling calm shatters her expectations. It is a terrifying lesson to learn, but the absolute deadliest predators in our lives almost never wear the faces of the monsters we imagine in our heads. Dante appears in his early 30s, but the heavy streaks of silver in his dark hair betray the burden of ruling a criminal empire. His eyes hold no reckless fire, only the freezing calculation of an executioner. He speaks softly, yet completely dominates the room. When Lena states she was kidnapped, he smoothly twists the narrative, making it sound as if she walked in willingly. It is a masterclass in manipulation. He recites every detail about the dead man, proving his eyes are everywhere. Lena nervously repeats the hitman's final warning, and for just a fraction of a second, Dante's jaw tightens. There is a universal truth right there. No matter how perfectly we build our emotional armor, the exact right words will always expose a crack in our walls. What flickers across his face is not grief. It is the cold fury of a grandmaster watching his best piece fall. He quietly admits Marcus is difficult to replace. Fueled by reckless adrenaline, Lena demands to know who killed him. Instead of punishing her, Dante simply watches the fierce light burning in her eyes. He sees a raw courage that could be the perfect weapon. She spins around to leave C's, but the doors are sealed. His wheelchair hums forward, trapping her in his gravity. Then comes the proposition. Play his devoted wife for exactly 1 year, and her brother's massive medical debt vanishes forever. She calls him insane. But listen, desperation is a heavy anchor, and it will often drag us down dark paths we once swore we would never walk. Stick with me here, because we need to unpack the sinister logic of this game. 6 months ago, a violent crash confined the legendary boss to that chair. In the brutal world of the Mafia, showing physical weakness is like bleeding into a pool of starving sharks. Dante desperately needs a human shield. He needs a pristine wife to project absolute stability to his enemies. And he targeted Lena, not because of romance, but because he saw a woman drowning in hospital bills. He looked at her shattering tragedy and recognized the perfect advantage. This is the absolute harshest lesson the shadows can teach us. True predators never seek out an equal opponent. They patiently hunt for a breaking heart, someone they can easily manipulate and control for their own survival. Look into Lena's exhausted eyes right now. She should be utterly terrified by this underworld contract. But beneath the fear, there is a dangerous spark of relief. Dante lays out the cold. Hard rules without a shred of hesitation. Spend 1 year living in his fortress. Fake a convincing smile for the ruthless paparazzi. And her brother is completely saved. He promises it is strictly business, an arrangement totally devoid of real emotion. But you and I both know the truth. Stepping into the arms of a mob boss is never a clean transaction. We constantly do this to ourselves, do we not? We walk straight into the flames, foolishly convincing ourselves we can dance with the devil and somehow walk away without our souls catching fire. The clock is ticking. 24 hours. Dante drops that deadline like a lead weight, playing the ultimate mind game. He leaves the door open, pretending she has a choice, already knowing her world outside is burning. She wanders back to her freezing, cramped apartment, her mind spinning out into the dark, and here is where the heartbreak sets in. She walks through that thin door and finds little Danny, boiling water for cheap, instant noodles, doing the math on their pathetic grocery budget. She wants nothing more than to collapse on the linoleum and confess the entire mafia contract right then and there. But she doesn't. She bites the inside of her cheek until she tastes copper, swallowing the secret whole. Because at the end of the day, the heaviest chains we drag through this life are the painful truths we bury, just to keep the ones we love safe. Stick with me tonight, because this is the exact moment you hear the steel jaws of the trap click shut. Lena sits in the dark, the brutal memory of Marcus Chen's elimination playing on a loop in her head. It is a glaring, bloody warning of Dante's absolute power, but she puts that nightmare on the scale opposite her brother's future, and the choice makes itself. By the following evening, she is stepping out of a private elevator flanked by the Don's armed shadows. She marches into his penthouse, firing off demands as if she actually holds a winning hand in this underworld casino. She truly believes she is writing her own story. But dealing with a starving wolf only ever gives you the illusion of holding the leash. We constantly confuse our desperate acts of survival for genuine bravery, completely blinding ourselves to the terrible cages we willingly step into. Let's step into that room together and just feel the suffocating tension in the air. Lena stands her ground, forcing this hardened crime lord to put every single boundary in ink. She claims the entire east wing of the penthouse for herself, building a desperate physical border to protect her fading sanity. She fights to keep her nursing job, clinging to a normal routine before Dante's dark world drowns her completely. He pushes back, knowing a public job means too many eyes. But he leans back, in the shadows, effortlessly selling the lie that this is merely a clean, professional transaction. Yet, if you look closely, her hands are trembling uncontrollably. It is strangely human how we draw fragile lines in the sand to comfort ourselves, forgetting entirely that the rising tide of our own choices will inevitably wash them all away. The agreement is sealed with a single handshake, and Dante's grip feels like cold, unyielding iron. Even confined to that leather wheelchair, he radiates the quiet, brutal violence that forged his criminal empire. You can see the cold emptiness in his eyes as he lays out an impossible timeline. Signatures by dawn, a public debut at Friday's high society gala, and a flawless fake wedding in exactly 2 weeks. It is a violently calculated blitz, designed to project an untouchable front before rival syndicates smell the blood in the water. Just 48 hours ago, Lena's biggest nightmare was a final notice on an electric bill. Tonight, she is legally binding her soul to a man who gives actual monsters nightmares. Life can violently pivot in the space of a single heartbeat, quietly trapping us in a dark room we never even noticed until the lock clicks shut behind us. As she turns to leave, Dante drops an unexpectedly soft thank you, quietly promising that this won't hurt, But as the private elevator plummets toward the street, and the amber city lights blur past the glass, the crushing gravity of her new reality finally hits. Her breathing turns ragged and thin in the empty space. She repeats the oldest survival lie in the book: "I am only doing this to keep my brother breathing." What she completely misses is the slow, psychological rot that infects you when you sleep under the same roof as a predator. That slow creeping dread is exactly how captivity sinks its teeth in. The real danger always begins the moment you trust the arsonist to rescue from the flames. By morning, golden sunlight hits his heavy mahogany desk, and her hand does not even tremble as she signs the papers, willingly locking the door to her own beautiful cage. You and I have probably both made this mistake before, because the real tragedy always starts with a brave, empty smile. Lena sits Danny down at their tiny table and spins a beautiful fiction about a lucrative new private nursing gig. She buries the agonizing truth deep in her chest that she just auctioned her soul to the local syndicate. By Friday night, the old Lena is systematically erased. Dante's handlers dress her in a stunning midnight blue gown, wrapping her identity in layers of blood money. When her little brother beams at how beautiful she looks, she swallows her own nausea and feeds him another sweet lie. Down on the street, Dante waits in the shadows of a blacked-out sedan, an undisputed king of the dark. It is a bitter pill to swallow. Every beautiful lie we tell to shield the people we love only builds a cold, unbreakable wall between our hearts and theirs. Pay close attention to the dawn when that heavy car pulls up to the gala. The second he leaves his sanctuary, the man turns to stone, radiating the chilling aura of an untouchable king. The ballroom is a dizzying monument to endless wealth, making Lena feel painfully out of place. But watch what happens as they enter. The entire hierarchy of the city's elite practically folds in half for him. His wheelchair only magnifies his terrifying no presence. It somehow only magnifies his terrifying presence. He leans slightly, his voice a low, gravelly whisper commanding her to stay close and hold that smile. It is a masterclass in quiet, suffocating dominance. Heart-hammering, she obeys without a second thought. It reveals a heavy truth. Real power is rarely about physical strength. It is the unshakable, magnetic belief that you own the very air everyone else breathes. Lena is barely surviving this blinding maze of camera flashes when the real danger steps out of the crowd. Enter Victoria. She is a rival syndicate boss with eyes that could freeze boiling water. Discovering that Lena is nothing but a civilian nurse, Victoria offers this perfectly toxic, calculated smirk, aiming to publicly humiliate her. Lena's spine goes rigid, her old survival instincts flaring to life. But Dante does not let her fight. His heavy hand clamps over her arm, not to offer comfort, but to mark his territory in front of an audience. Under the guise of a protector, he quietly strips away her independence, teaching her that she only survives if she hides behind him. Victoria steps back, but the threat of war hangs heavy in the air. It just proves a brutal reality of this world. A polite, razor-sharp smile from an enemy will often cut much deeper than a blade you can see coming. Let's sit in the back seat for this ride home. The silence is broken when Dante flatly admits that putting a ring on Lena's finger just incinerated his fragile truce with Victoria. He talks about human collateral like chess pieces, confirming Lena's worst fear. She is nothing but a beautiful human shield. As neon streetlights wash over his face, the physical cost of his dark empire is suddenly impossible to miss. Lena watches the muscles in his jaw ticking. His knuckles are a bloodless white gripping the leather armrest. The man is drowning in physical agony. But the second she leans forward to offer comfort, he snaps like a cornered animal, his voice ripping through the heavy quiet of the sedan. It is a bitter lesson about human armor The people who build the thickest iron walls to hide their suffering will instinctively try to destroy the hands that reach out to heal them. You can feel the suffocating distance between them in that car. For a kingpin like Dante, letting someone witness his pain is an unforgivable surrender of power. The rest of the drive is drowning in a toxic, heavy silence. Lena feels utterly hollowed out, pressing herself against the far door. But the moment they step into the penthouse and the heavy locks click into place, something inside her ignites. She steps right into his path, her voice trembling but fierce, demanding to know how they are supposed to survive a year of this frozen war. Instantly, the predator pivots. His terrifying mask slips away, replaced by a softly spoken, shockingly vulnerable apology. He feeds her just enough emotion to keep her standing there. It is a masterfully set trap. Always remember this. A gentle apology without genuine remorse is nothing but a beautifully braided leash. Defying every instinct, Lena steps right over his invisible tripwires. She offers to ease his pain, asking for absolutely nothing in return. To a man who treats every act of kindness as a concealed blade, this level of grace triggers every alarm in his head, and yet he unlocks the door to his freezing, dimly lit sanctuary. The fake wife persona vanishes. The seasoned nurse takes over. She moves quietly, organizing his heavy narcotics with practiced hands. When Dante manages a low, gravelly word of thanks, she dismisses it as nothing more than her job. But the emotional snare is already pulling tight. By nursing the broken flesh of a monster, her natural empathy begins to bleed directly into his venomous world. It exposes a fatal flaw in the human heart. We constantly confuse the simple act of bandaging a person's physical wounds with the divine power to actually save their blackened soul. Stay with me, because everything is about to fracture. Lena settles into the East Wing, which is nothing more than a sprawling, velvet-lined prison. Her entire universe shrinks to the rhythm of Dante's broken body. She learns to read the tension in his jaw, the shallow drag of his breathing. They circle each other in that silent apartment, both utterly terrified to drop their weapons. Then, late one night, the weight of the dawn's isolation seems to swallow him whole. Lena sits nearby in the quiet gloom and, for the first time, the kingpin's iron armor fractures. He softly confesses that the accident that took his legs was no accident at all. It was a calculated betrayal from inside his own family. It brings us to a harsh realization. True loneliness is never just about sitting in an empty room. It is the suffocating burden of breathing in a world that actively wants you buried in the dirt. Picture Dante in the low light, talking about the night he nearly bled out. There is not an ounce of anger in his tone, just that freezing calm of a man who looks death in the eye every single morning. He takes all the blame, twisting his own pain into a display of absolute control. When Lena quietly asks if he feels any regret, he gives a dry, hollow laugh. He tells her regret is a waste of breath since we are all decaying anyway. But then she crosses a dangerous line. She insists he use her first name. The second the name leaves his lips, the air in the room practically catches fire, his dark eyes narrow. He knows money alone does not buy this kind of fierce loyalty. Here is the truth of it. The exact second we drop our heavy defensive walls is the exact moment we hand somebody the knife. The heavy shadows of the bedroom turn into a twisted confessional. Caught in a thin slice of moonlight, Lena finally shatters. Her voice trembles as she spills the brutal reality about her brother fighting leukemia, the crushing medical bills, her desperate choice to auction off her own life just to keep him breathing. She braces herself, waiting for Dante to show disgust. But he just sits there, his dark eyes completely still. Slowly, he validates every single drop of her pain. He twists her moral guilt into a masterpiece of pure survival, whispering that only the weak die in his world. It makes her feel understood in the most dangerous way possible. Listen closely to this. Shared trauma, especially when a predator holds the strings, creates a bond far stronger than any iron chain. You and I need to look at the shattered pieces of a past to understand how deep this goes. After losing her parents, Lena threw away her medical career to raise her little brother. Dante targets this bleeding wound with deadly precision. Picture them sitting in the dark until dawn. He holds her shaking hand, whispering thanks just for being treated like a normal man. It is a brilliant, terrifying illusion of vulnerability. As the fake marriage gets closer, Danny senses the emptiness in her eyes. He confronts her. Instead of crying for help, she lies to her only anchor. The lesson here hits hard. Isolation is always the very first demand of a predator. The exact second you hide your reality from the people who truly love you, the cage door finally snaps shut. Pushed into a dark corner, a wounded bird will fiercely defend its own cage. As Lena mentions the impending marriage, Danny's face drains of color. His voice splinters. Did she sell her soul to pay off his hospital debts? The brutal accuracy of his terror almost shatters her fragile mask. But Dante's venom is already pumping through her veins. Holding her brother's desperate gaze, she spins a wild fairy tale about a sudden romance. When a panicking Danny demands to meet this phantom fiancé, she deflects, stalling for time she simply does not have. This reveals a sobering truth. Severe desperation forces good people to build massive walls of deceit, and inevitably, the person building those lies becomes the permanent prisoner trapped inside them. The erasure of Lena's identity begins in total silence. Stylists handle her like a rare artifact, draping her in silk that feels like a brand of ownership. When a guard casually calls her the new wife of the Varley family, her old self vanishes. She is mafia property now. The wedding is a master class in suffocating control, leaving Danny as the sole bewildered witness. At the altar, Dante sits frozen in his wheelchair. He weaponizes his frailty, projecting a terrifying mix of absolute authority and victimhood. Their vows echo like a hollow corporate contract. Remember this crucial life lesson. When an environment actively works to erase your personal history, it is never an accident. It is a calculated move, preparing you to blindly submit to a dangerous new reality. That public kiss is nothing but a sterile seal on a devil's bargain. The reception is pure theater. Lena forces a flawless, painted smile for elite mob guests who silently calculate her exact purchase price. Later, back in the cavernous penthouse, the air turns absolutely frigid. They stand on opposite sides of the room, separated by an ocean of unspoken tension. Trembling, she desperately reminds him they only have 1 year together on this contract. Yet, the toxic roots of Stockholm Syndrome are already digging deep. She starts seeing a tragic poetry in her captor, romanticizing the literal monster hiding in the shadows. The lesson here is absolute. When you negotiate the price of your soul with a cold calculating machine, you never get to control the terms of your own survival. The early days of this dark marriage are defined by strategic avoidance. Dante commands the silence from his office, hot and pure dominance to establish dominance without lifting a finger. To escape that suffocating air, Lena uses her hospital shifts as a sanctuary. She moves Danny to a safe apartment, washing syndicate blood money through a lie about corporate benefits. The crushing weight of this deception exhausts her to the bone. When Danny notices her hollow cheeks and says she looks like a ghost, he tries to help. She instantly deflects him, instinctively protecting her captor's narrative like a shield. The lesson here is universally true. Physical comfort purchased at the high cost of moral compromise will always bankrupt your internal peace of mind. Hearing Danny say Danny treats her like a business asset cuts too close to the bone. Unable to face that truth, Lena panics. She bolts right back into the lion's den, stumbling into a lethal syndicate meeting in the penthouse. Dante sits there, flanked by Vincent and Carlo. Their expensive suits fail to mask the heavy aura of brutal violence. With ice in his veins, Dante introduces her as his wife, turning a sacred word into a dark territorial warning for his men. Vincent offers a polite smile, but his handshake is a calculated psychological probe. That dead, empty smile makes her skin physically crawl. Here is a simple life lesson. Your gut intuition is rarely wrong. When your biology screams that a politely smiling face belongs to a dangerous predator, you must always listen. Vincent smirks, claiming Dante is simply being protective. It is a cunning probe to test the master's leash. Beside him, Carlo refuses to even stand, a silent microaggression rejecting her new status. When Dante ends the gathering, Vincent's welcome to the family lands like a velvet-wrapped threat. Left alone, Dante softly invites Lena to ask whatever she desires. Yet, when she speaks, he gives her absolutely nothing. It is a terrifying display of cognitive dominance. Let us unpack this together. You and I. He controls her reality by carefully rationing the truth. The life lesson here is visceral. Real intimacy cannot survive where information is weaponized. If someone demands your vulnerability while offering only stone walls in return, they are not protecting you. They are managing you. Dante leans back into the shadows, whispering that she knew exactly what she was buying into. It is the classic maneuver of a megalomaniac dumping the psychological burden back onto the victim. Then, he shifts tactics. He reveals the bloody mechanics of his crime family, painting himself as a tragic martyr who absorbs the violence so she can exist in luxury. This calculated flash of exhaustion is the final catalyst. Her natural empathy overrides her primal survival instinct. She looks at the monster and only sees a lonely, broken man, bonding deeply with her captor's trauma. The lesson here is incredibly tragic. Empathy is a beautiful trait. But when handed to a calculated predator, it becomes the heavy iron chain dragging you down into the dark. Dante cloaks his obsession with control under a quiet, practical veneer. Looking deep into her eyes, he softly whispers that her stubborn persistence is not a flaw. It is a twisted stroke of psychological manipulation designed to make her feel completely seen in the dark. The heavy air between them grows thick and fragile. But that deceptive spell shatters the exact second his phone violently rings. Jolted back to reality, Lena bolts. She runs straight to the sterile lights of the hospital, claiming an early medical shift just to escape the penthouse before he wakes up. The lesson here reveals a profound truth of human nature. We will almost always sprint right back toward the familiar chaos we understand, rather than face the terrifying quiet of a beautifully gilded cage. Picture the emergency room. It is a total wreck, perfectly matching the absolute mess inside Lena's head. Her co-workers keep hyping up her sudden marriage, believing it is a fairy tale romance. Lena just stands there, forcing a painful fake smile. For a woman slowly sinking into Stockholm Syndrome, all this cluelessness feels like acid poured on an open wound. She buries herself deep in the frantic hustle of trauma care just to hide. But then Dante calls. His voice is pure ice. He demands she show up to a formal dinner with Vincent. The violent clash of her two worlds triggers a massive panic attack. Here is a solid life lesson. You can never neatly box up your darkest secrets. Eventually, those fragile walls will cave in, and your absolute worst nightmare will walk right through the front door. Let's look at this closely. The black sedan rolls up at 8 calculated trap. Inside the car waits a perfectly calculated trap. Bua, a beautiful red dress, and a handwritten note from Dante. Most would see a mobster dictating their clothes as a massive red flag. Yet Lena feels a strange, twisted comfort. This is psychological warfare, where the captive mistakes the cage for a warm embrace. She puts on the dress, trading her peace for his dark fantasy. The second they lock eyes, he tears her down, coldly pointing out how tired she looks. They ride the elevator in suffocating silence. It brings us to a harsh reality we all have to learn. The hardest prisons to escape are never built with heavy iron bars. They are beautifully woven from soft, delicate silk. The air in this room is completely suffocating. Vincent sits back in the shadows, quietly setting the stage for a brutal interrogation. Dante walks straight to the head of the table, demanding total authority. Vincent instantly starts poking the bear, hinting that Dante is hiding a massive secret, testing the fragile limits of this fake marriage. Notice Lena in this exact moment. Instead of stepping away from the danger, she actually leans closer to the man holding her captive. Her trembling hand reaches out to Dante. He takes it, his grip dangerously warm and terrifyingly smooth. It reminds us of a painful lesson life loves to teach. When you are completely surrounded by hungry wolves in the pitch black, you will almost always lean against the one wolf you foolishly believe you can tame. Watch this twisted dynamic unfold. Vincent goes straight for the throat, bringing up the tragic loss of Lena's parents with a sickeningly sweet smile. He praises her resilience, but make no mistake, that is a calculated threat dressed as a compliment. While Vincent slowly twists the knife, Dante sits there like a statue carved from ice. A seasoned boss never interrupts a loyalty test. He simply watches her jaw clench, waiting to see if she carries that same cold blood in her veins. It is a brutal scene, but it leaves us with a heavy truth. The deepest scars we try desperately to hide are the exact targets toxic people will always hunt for. They will press their thumb right into those old wounds, just to see how much pressure you can take before your spirit finally shatters. The trap finally snaps shut over dessert. Vincent completely drops the nice guy act, hitting Lena with the cold facts. This nothing more than an insurance policy. She is nothing more than an insurance policy, purchased to keep Dante's empire standing after his accident. The reality hits her like a physical blow. She is not a cherished bride. She is a human shield, bought and paid for to hold rival families at bay. Then Dante speaks, his deep voice cutting the heavy silence. He tells her to remember her place, sounding exactly like a ruthless man checking his warehouse inventory. It highlights a deeply uncomfortable truth about our choices. We are often quick to trade away pieces of our freedom just to feel a fleeting sense of security. But we always realize, way too late, that the devil never forgets to collect his due. Vincent drops a line about needing clarity, which is nothing but elegant slang for a death threat. Later, in the quiet darkness of the ride home, Lena's walls finally crumble. She looks at Dante, begging him to promise he won't hurt her if she fails at playing his perfect wife. His response is a single freezing word: don't. It is pure, terrifying psychological control. Driving back to his glass penthouse, Lena stares out into the city lights, desperately wishing she could go back to the simple anxiety of unpaid rent. She traded her quiet freedom for a heavy diamond collar. It exposes a tragic reality we often ignore. We hustle relentlessly to escape our daily hardships, convinced that status will solve everything. But we usually discover that the grand palace at the top of the hill is really just a beautifully decorated prison cell. High up in that penthouse, the dead silence finally shatters Lena. She drops the tough exterior and admits she feels like a completely disposable pawn in his twisted game. She searches Dante's cold eyes desperately begging to find 1 ounce of humanity beneath his armor. For a fleeting second, that armor actually cracks. His knuckles turn white as he quietly confesses how exhausting it is to constantly uphold his terrifying reputation. Underneath it all, he is terrified of what happens if the monster mask slips. It is a tragic glimpse into how toxic pride slowly rots a man from the inside out. The truth of it is incredibly simple. The massive walls we build to protect our fragile hearts from the rough world are usually the exact same walls that end up suffocating us, leaving us completely alone in the dark. This is the precise moment Lena loses her footing. She catches one fleeting glimpse of the broken man hiding behind the ruthless empire, and her first instinct is to step closer and fix him. Dante is a complete control fanatic, paralyzed by the emptiness inside his own chest. When he reaches out and grips her hand, the air grows dangerously heavy. But then, in a heartbeat, he ruins it. Instead of offering genuine warmth, he smirks and coldly praises her for being such a convincing actress. Lena pulls back instantly, disgusted that she almost let herself care for a walking tragedy. It leaves us with a deeply haunting life lesson. The absolute most dangerous second in any toxic dynamic is the exact moment the monster finally reveals a tiny, soft spot, tricking you into believing you possess the magic power to actually save them. Stick with me here, because we need to see how this mind game takes hold. Lena retreats to her room, desperately trying to build a mental fortress, but the poison is already in her veins. After a sleepless night of quiet threats, she does the only thing she can. She adapts. She learns to play the flawless wife, flashing perfectly empty smiles in rooms filled with dangerous men. She clings to her hospital job just to touch something normal, even as her own brother begins to distance himself. The trap is working to absolute perfection. It reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth about the nature of survival. Normalizing a chaotic, toxic environment never happens all at once. It is a slow, quiet fade. If you force yourself to survive in the pitch black for long enough, you will eventually forget what the sun even looks like. The heaviest consequence of Lena's bargain is how quickly the isolation suffocates her. Her brother Danny, he senses the dark shift immediately. The warm phone calls stop, replaced by cold, distant messages. When Lena finally confronts him, the absolute disgust in his eyes breaks her. He accuses her of selling out for dirty money, completely blind to the nightmare she is enduring. She stands there frozen, screaming inside her mind that his very survival was purchased with her freedom. But the words just die in her throat. Danny turns his back on the sister who traded her soul to erase his debts. It brings us face to face with a heavy reality about loneliness. True isolation isn't sitting by yourself in an empty room. It is standing right next to the person you love most in the world, carrying a brutal secret you can never speak aloud. Lena finds Dante in the shadows, drowning his nerves in whiskey right after a brutal shootout. He looks up at her and weaves an intoxicating lie, framing his ruthless violence as a tragic burden he carries to keep the streets safe. It is pure, calculated delusion. But instead of turning away, Lena stays. She allows his twisted reasoning to slowly rewrite her reality. She begins to see a sick poetry in his violence, desperate to believe he is just a misunderstood protector. Watching her sink into that illusion is painful, but it delivers a striking reality check. The most destructive lies we ever encounter are rarely the ones fed to us by our enemies. The truly dangerous lies are the beautiful fairy tales we invent in our own heads, just to justify holding on to the toxic people we refuse to walk away from. You and I really need to unpack the dark energy here. Dante executes his next mind game flawlessly. He quietly asks what she would do with his power, deliberately baiting her empathy. Clinging to her fading morals, Lena breaks down, crying that love should always conquer power. She weeps over losing. Her brother, terrified Danny will discover later she sacrificed her life for his debts. Dante sees that open emotional wound and strikes like a viper. He grabs her hand, whispering that they are exactly the same, just two broken souls crushed by ruthless families. It is a sickening manipulation, weaponizing her trauma to keep her chained. This points to a tragic mistake we often make. We constantly confuse shared trauma for genuine love, completely forgetting that when two drowning people grab onto each other, they only sink to the bottom twice as fast. Let's look at the massive reality check hitting Lena right now. She quietly whispers that she needs to run, fully aware she is standing entirely too close to a raging fire, but her feet remain glued to the floor. She is actively gaslighting herself, desperately trying to rebrand this ruthless boss as her only safe space. The second she openly admits she cannot pull away, the heavy door of her mental prison slams shut. Dante does not offer comfort. He just gives a slow, terrifying smirk, total predator mode. He knows he's finally secured his prey. This leaves us with a chilling realization to carry forward. Spotting a massive warning sign means absolutely nothing if you do not have the courage to walk away from it. We will always find a way to invent a beautiful, comforting lie just to swallow the poison we deliberately chose for ourselves. The air in their shadowed hideout hangs heavy tonight, thick with a quiet, brewing disaster. We find Dante locked in absolute agony, muscles trembling, jaw wired tight. A man forged in the violent fires of the underground cannot show a single crack of weakness, not even as his body betrays him. When Lena approaches, he pushes her away, practically vibrating with silent pain. But that raw, unspoken suffering is the exact hook she cannot resist. The tragedy of a savior is that she needs his brokenness to feel whole. It locks them into a devastating psychological dance. And here is a truth we all learn eventually. We are never more blind to our own manipulation than when we are absolutely convinced we are the ones saving the other person. Notice how fast the gravity shifts in this room. The shadows highlight the war in Dante's eyes, a violent collision of pure rage and a vulnerability he despises. By forcing her hands onto his seizing muscles, Lena strips the control freak of his ultimate armor. He tries to build the walls back, his voice slicing through the night to remind her she was bought to play a wife, not a nurse. But her reckless empathy pushes past the warning. As the heat of her hands melts his tension, a dangerously fragile intimacy fills the cold room. He mutters that men like him cannot afford a moment of rest. Keep this quiet lesson in your pocket. Carrying the weight of someone else's trauma does not heal them. It just builds a private road to drag their sickness straight into your own heart. You and I have to pause here, because this is where the paper-thin illusion of their arrangement finally tears apart. Dante looks down at his shaking hand, his voice dripping with venom, as he confesses the failure of his own legs. For a king built on total fear, admitting that truth is like peeling off his own flesh. But Lena does not run from the monster. She steps deeper into the dark, tossing the cold cash contract aside to play the devoted wife. Dante watches her closely, testing just how deep his psychological venom has seeped into her veins. When he asks why she stays, she hands him a total victory. The lesson here leaves a bitter taste. The exact moment you start building excuses for the people destroying you, you are welding the bars of your own cage. Dante slams the heavy steel door on his own heart. Before things can go too far, he barks an order for her to stop, freezing the air before she can confess what is really happening. Lena retreats to her empty room, the cold reality settling over her shoulders. She is not a savior. She is a hostage wrapped in silk. But Dante is a master of the slow bleed. A neatly folded note slips under her door, carrying a quiet word of thanks. It is a calculated, tiny drop of humanity designed to keep her starved, but tethered to his wrist. Then the designer gowns arrive, sealing the trap. The truth we face here is terrifying. A single drop of gentle kindness from a man who starves you of basic respect is the most dangerous snare you will ever walk into. Let the music fade down for a second and picture this massive ballroom. The golden light from the chandeliers hits the floor, illuminating 500 of the most dangerous people in the city. This is Dante's hunting ground. He keeps Lena anchored to his side, wiping out her freedom while wearing the mask of a fiercely protective husband. Lena feels the cold stare of hungry predators tracking her every breath. Just as the suffocating weight of this fake life pushes her under, Richard Blackwood glides into view. He wears a $1 million smile that does an awful job hiding his lethal hunger. We all know this lesson by heart. The warmest, most magnetic smiles in a room full of power are almost always the ones hiding the sharpest blades just out of sight. The light catches Richard's eyes, and there is nothing but dead winter in them. He circles them like an apex predator, aiming right at Lena to find a crack in Dante's heavy armor. Lena forces a stiff, practiced smile, blocking his mind games with a wall of polite ice. When Richard throws a loaded comment about Dante hiding his violent empire, it is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Lena does not blink. She agrees with the lie, playing the perfect oblivious wife. Richard smirks, seeing the invisible strings Dante has tied around her mind. Dante's knuckles turn white on the wheels of his chair, stepping between them like a loaded gun. Listen closely to this. When a man forces a massive life decision at breakneck speed, he is always outrunning a ghost. I want you to sit with me and watch temperature drop in this conversation. Richard leans in closer, his voice low, dragging up the toxic whispers from the criminal underground. Dante replies with that terrifying, quiet gravel in his throat, flexing a dark power that needs no volume. But Richard knows where to press. He weaponizes their sudden wedding, searching for the blood under the floorboards. Dante snaps, but then Lena steps right into the line of fire. She violently defends the man, who essentially bought her freedom. Spinning a tale of private, consuming romance, Richard just watches her, highly amused by her desperate loyalty. The lesson is a tough pill to swallow. Real devotion is nearly impossible to prove when everyone knows exactly how much it cost. The fragile glass breaks when Lena finally loses her temper. Panic floods her chest as she demands Richard strip away the polite metaphors and say it to her face. Dante sees the mask slipping and grips her wrist hard, a silent command to kill the emotion. But Richard feeds on the chaos. He leans into the silence and calls her exactly what she is, a paid actress hired to make a shattered king look whole. Lena cries out against the lie, totally blind to the hollow echo in her own voice. She starts listing how they take care of each other, how they survive the dark nights. Here is a brutal mirror for anyone listening. The absolute second you try to prove your worth by listing the chores you do to survive, you are admitting your heart is just a business transaction. The energy shifts violently as Dante rolls his chair forward, cutting off the space between his fragile wife and the smiling wolf. It looks like protection to the crowd, but it is pure, unadulterated ownership. Richard backs away into the crowd, satisfied that he found the bleeding wound. Dante leans his head close to Lena, his voice dropping into the freezing dark. He reminds her they are not at a party. They are walking through a minefield. For the rest of the night, they put on a painfully beautiful, empty performance. Lena smiles for the flashes, checking out of her own mind just to keep her heart beating. It is a heavy truth we all face eventually. Performing a massive public lie for the world will drain your soul entirely faster than any quiet, ugly reality. We slip away into the quiet shadows of the ballroom, where Margaret Chen stands like a ghost of the underworld. She speaks about her violently murdered husband with a calm that freezes the blood. It is the hollow sound of a woman who built a fortress of denial just to keep her sanity intact. Lena, still clinging to a desperate need to heal things, reaches out to apologize. Margaret absolutely shreds the gesture. Her voice is devoid of warmth, as she calls love a cheap poison for the weak, insisting that cold, blind loyalty is the only currency that keeps a pulse beating. You can see the terror finally set in on Lena's face. The lesson here is deadly and true. When you find yourself surrounded by starving wolves, showing your soft underbelly is just an invitation to be consumed. Lena searches the older woman's face, begging to find one small trace of lingering warmth or regret. But Margaret offers only a fractured, broken smile, a monument to trauma and survival. She whispers that love is the exact reason she stayed, proving that affection is just the lie they tell themselves to endure the nightmare. Look across the room with me for a second. Dante is wearing his mask flawlessly, swimming through a sea of absolute sharks. In that lonely moment, Lena feels the cold steel of her marriage contract locking shut. But later, as the music slows, Dante watches the floor. His impenetrable armor cracks for just 1 second. He admits he misses the feeling of dancing, and the grief in his voice is crushing. The heaviest chains we wear are forged from silent grief. Close your eyes and picture the visual poetry of this final moment. Lena walks slowly toward Dante, reaching out to take his rough, scarred hands. The metal of his wheelchair sits between them like a barricade, yet it is the only thing anchoring them in the middle of a ruthless spinning world. The room goes dead silent. The worst men in the city stop to watch this terrifying display of vulnerability. Lena shuts her eyes tight, drowning out the monsters circling them. When the final chord fades into the dark, Dante looks up from the shadows and whispers a quiet thank you for not treating him like a broken thing. It leaves us with a quiet warning for the road. In the middle of a cold war, the deadliest mistake you can make is lowering your shield just to feel a fleeting spark of warmth. Picture this, late-night listeners. The black sedan crawls through the empty streets. The silence inside heavier than the dark outside. They just survived Richard, and Lena looks hollowed out from wearing a fake face all night. But look closer. There is a quiet, twisted thrill in her eyes. They actually beat his mental torture. In the dim light, Dante finally acknowledges she survived his brutal, blood-soaked world. But then she casually mentions their contract only has 9 months left. The temperature to his chest. It lands like a blade to his chest. Let us sit with this heavy truth for a minute. You and I. Real captivity was never about iron bars. The truest prison is built the exact moment the cage door swings wide open, and you decide you would rather die than ever walk away. Lena refuses to step back, her fingers wrapped tight around his sleeve, anchoring him to the floor. She forces him to stand there and feel the agonizing tension in the room, completely breaking Blackwood's attempt to poison his mind. Dante tries to lean into that freezing, untouchable mafia boss persona. But you can physically see the weight crush his shoulders. That invincible armor he wears, it cracks wide open. He softly admits their fake alliance is hanging by a single thread, and if the syndicate catches on, his entire underground empire burns down. He begs her to play the part harder. Then the real confession slips out. If she leaves, whatever is left of his soul goes with her. It is a harsh reality we all face. The absolute greatest risk you will ever take in this life is simply admitting out loud that somebody else actually matters to you. The air in the room practically vanishes. Lena struggles to breathe, her mind screaming to run, but her body refusing to move. She stares into his eyes and drops a quiet, devastating confession. That fake paper contract died weeks ago, and her loyalty is entirely real now. Dante immediately goes cold, slamming his emotional doors shut. He warns her that stepping from hostage to willing partner is a straight drop into hell. He even tries to use her 9-month escape plan, but her fear is gone. Fear is gone. She leans in close, her voice barely a breath, and asks the fatal question, "What if I never want to leave?" It is a tragic piece of the human condition. Sometimes we build our own beautiful, toxic cages and call them home. Dante totally breaks, crossing the floor and tearing down every single wall left between them. The shadows swallow the room, and Dante is visibly drowning in the heavy silence. The raw truth bleeds out of him. He admits that keeping her chained up on a legal document would eat him alive with guilt. But Lena refuses to let him push her away. Her hand rests gently against his jaw, her voice fierce as she tells him he has to earn her loyalty every single day from now on. What follows is nothing like the staged smiles of their fake wedding. It is raw, desperate survival. They hold on to each other, like the floor is caving in. Lena is completely surrendering to the very man who turned her world upside down. When the heavy adrenaline finally fades, the cold reality hits them hard. Dante knows there is no going back. But here is the thing about the dark. Sometimes the only way to survive a brutal storm is to close your eyes to the lightning. She holds on to him tightly. The morning light creeps in, painting a normal picture against a vicious mob war raging outside. Watching them exist like an ordinary couple feels surreal. Lena crashes from total exhaustion. When she opens her eyes, Dante is standing vigil by the window, like a phantom holding back the door. The next few weeks blur into this quiet isolation. The boss of the underworld refuses to leave the house, hovering because she is the only thing keeping him human. Lena pretends to work just to breathe his air. Then her brother Danny walks through the door, and the illusion shatters. He sees right through it. That tense, terrified hostage energy is completely gone. Lena cannot even hold his gaze. It reveals a terrifying mystery. You can never truly explain how the monster under your bed became the only reason you sleep at night. The tension hits a breaking point right here. Danny gets straight into his sister's face, demanding answers. She is drowning in panic, desperately trying to cover up the twisted roots of her marriage, terrified that a single slip will burn her fake life to the ground. When Dante quietly enters the room, Danny catches the subtle shift. He watches Lena naturally lean toward the very man holding her captive. Later that night, Dante decides to play a cruel game. He casually suggests telling her brother the absolute truth, that she traded her entire future just to keep Danny breathing. Lena's blood runs cold. Handing her brother that kind of suffocating guilt is pure poison. It brings us to a crushing reality. If you build a beautiful illusion on top of a massive sacrifice, be prepared to spend the rest of your life defending it with exhausting lies. You can almost hear the quiet chaos tearing Lena's mind apart. Dante circles her in the dark, his deep voice smoothly reminding her that keeping secrets is just a coward's way of lying. The mere thought of her brother discovering her twisted reality leaves her paralyzed. We find her later, sitting in the dead silence of her room, clutching that original marriage contract. Her eyes trace the exit clause. It promises total freedom in exactly 6 months. Anyone else would be weeping tears of joy, packing a bag to disappear into the night. But as she stares at the ink, she begins to tremble. A heavy, suffocating panic takes over. It unearths a deeply tragic truth that haunts the human soul. The ultimate tragedy in life is finally realizing the villain holding your cage keys is the exact person you want to stay locked up with forever. The piano notes turn heavy here, sinking right into your chest. Lena is completely drowning in her own delusions, quietly convincing herself that the very architect of her nightmare is the only soul who truly understands her. That paper guaranteeing her freedom, it suddenly feels like a loaded gun pressed directly against her heart. She stares at the words until the room spins. A sudden knock at the door violently shatters the trance. She shoves the contract away just as Dante slips into the room. Desperate to mask her panic, she pivots, crying softly about her brother pulling away. Dante simply sits back in the darkness, a predator analyzing his prey. He feeds her a perfectly comforting, watered-down version of the truth. It is a chilling reminder for us all. A sweet-sounding half-truth spoken by a predator will always destroy you much faster than a straight-up lie. Pull up a chair. You and I need to look closely at what is really unfolding in the shadows here. Strip away the dangerous romance, and you are staring at textbook trauma bonding. Dante is playing a grandmaster game of psychological chess. When he showed her his broken, vulnerable side, that was not romance. It was a highly calibrated weapon. By painting himself as a damaged protector trapped by his own bloodline, he perfectly hijacked her deepest vulnerability, her pure empathy. Watch the way her throat catches in the quiet room. That is the exact second the steel trap snaps shut around her heart. It leaves us staring at a deeply agonizing fact of life. The darkest chapters of our stories usually begin the exact moment we convince ourselves we can fix the very people who are quietly, methodically tearing us apart. The lens pulls in tight as Lena finally whispers the word love, and the sound makes the blood run cold. We are watching a psychological surrender happen in real time. Listen to the haunting tone of her voice. There is no joy there, only the hollow exhaustion of a fighter laying down her sword. Dante reacts with cold, calculated mastery. He gently mentions the vicious turf wars in the streets and the ticking clock on their agreement. She still holds the pen, the illusion that she still holds the pen to her story. A master predator never forces you into the dark. They arrange the shadows so you beg them to lock you inside. He calls her too fragile for his world, brilliantly baiting her to stay. The lesson here is utterly terrifying. Flawless manipulation happens when the victim firmly believes putting on the chains was their own brilliant idea. The atmosphere turns completely suffocating as Dante finally feeds his own massive ego. He openly confesses he will let her stay, fully knowing it will drag his criminal empire into a violent bloodbath. This is the absolute summit of their shared madness. They have shredded the one document that offered safety, choosing instead to drown in this beautiful nightmare. When Lena reaches out and fiercely yanks him closer, it breaks your heart. She is clinging to the villain of her story just to feel a fragile sense of control. The intense collision between them is not some cinematic romance. It is two damaged souls permanently sealing a highly toxic bond. It leaves a heavy truth hanging in the air. Mix enough pure, terrifying adrenaline with a deeply toxic attachment, and walking away suddenly becomes the most impossible thing you will ever try to do. The pale sun rises on these two tangled in the heavy sheets, that life-saving contract now shoved under a pillow, like forgotten garbage. In the quiet dawn, Dante whispers that waking up beside her is terrifying, yet exactly right. It is a massive crack in the armor of a mob king. But the cold light of reality always follows. As the weeks drag on, the crushing psychological weight anchors them down. The thin line between desperate survival and tragic love is entirely erased. Later, when Vincent watches them from the shadows, He is not admiring a happy couple. He is a secondary predator realizing the alpha dog has just successfully broken a brand new hostage. It leaves us with a chilling final thought. The absolute deepest, most permanent scars we carry in this world rarely ever leave a single physical mark. Picture the scene with me, just you and I, watching from the corner of this dimly lit room. Heavy shadows crawl across Vincent's face as he picks apart their illusion, going straight for the throat by weaponizing Lena's quiet hospital job. But watch Dante react. The Don steps into the line of fire, instantly shielding her like a knight. It is a beautiful, agonizing paradox. By playing the protector, he is quietly pulling the chains around her heart even tighter. Then Vincent lets the name slip. Richard Blackwood. The air turns to ice. Blackwood is holding a match to their paper fortress, and you can see their survival instincts flare into a blind panic. The hardest truth we ever have to face in this life is that the very hands we beg for shelter are so often the ones welding our cages shut. Look closely at Lena's face in the heavy silence. The shift in her eyes is absolutely chilling. External threats do not break a trauma bond. Black has not just done his homework. Blackwood has not done his homework. He dug up the entire graveyard of their past. Secret ledgers, hospital bills, and the exact paper trail of blood money that bought her life. Vincent lays out the stakes with a cold voice. Blackwood wants the territory, and this fragile marriage is his battering ram. But look at her. Her stomach drops, not out of fear for her own life, but out of sheer terror for Dante's criminal empire. She is desperately looking for a padlock to protect him. We often learn too late that when you spend enough time surviving a monster, you eventually start helping them sharpen their teeth. The absolute tragedy of this moment hits with a suffocating weight. Lena actually volunteers herself as the sacrifice. She looks them in the eye and tells them to force the criminal underworld to swallow the lie that their romance is real. She is willingly stepping onto a public stage to direct her own hostage situation. Vincent instantly calculates the sick genius of her play, picking the upcoming charity ball for their debut. And when Dante drops his voice, whispering a soft apology for dragging her into his mafia mess, do not fall for it. That is a calculated drop of guilt designed to hook her deeper. Lena whispers back that she chose him, completely erasing the violence that trapped her. The saddest delusion a human heart can carry is convincing itself that the iron bars keeping it locked away are actually protective walls. Stick with me here, because you and I are about to break this psychological nightmare down. The charity ball is ticking like a hidden bomb, and the crisis explodes 2 weeks early. Blackwood weaponizes the receipts, threatening to leak the financials unless Dante hands over his turf. Watch the mob boss work his dark magic. Dante casually turns his monitor to Lena, showing her the blackmail. This is a master trap. He quietly offers to surrender his empire, acting like he is throwing away his life's work just to keep her safe. By pretending to fold, he forces her to scream for war. His clenched fists are pure acting to trigger her savior complex. We must always beware of those who eagerly play the martyr. They are usually just handing us a heavy sword so we can fight their bloody battles for them while they watch. The plot twist right here is absolutely heartbreaking. Lena invents a desperate third option, deciding to hijack the narrative by weaponizing the truth. Her wild idea is to stand up in public, admit the marriage started as a dirty mob transaction, but swear it mutated into real love. The hostage is literally writing the script for her own captivity. Dante acts shocked by her bravery, a masterclass in making her feel like the one in control. She honestly thinks owning the dark origin story strips away its power. But look at the brutal reality. She is forging her own steel chains and pulling them so tight that the Don never has to lift a finger again. True freedom is never found by beautifully decorating the walls of your prison. It is only ever found by kicking down the door and walking away. This is where the toxicity reaches maximum overdrive. Dante pulls off a perfectly timed silence, acting deeply worried about the public backlash she might face. It works instantly. Lena strips off her victim label and begs to be the sacrifice. With tears streaming down her face, she confesses her love, framing their hostage situation as a massive romantic victory. Dante pulls her in close, physically anchoring his prize. Then he flips the script, spinning his abusive behavior as a tragic fight against his own inner demons. They are remixing a nightmare contract into a beautiful fairy tale. We often rewrite our darkest histories, not because we forget the pain, but because the raw truth is simply too heavy a ghost for our fragile minds to carry on a daily basis. Did you catch how fast the tender illusion vanishes? Instantly, Dante snaps out of the hug to boss up the room, his cold nature taking the wheel. For 2 agonizing weeks, they drill this fake cover story until Lena's heart stops panicking. She is brainwashing herself in real time, but reality does not care about your written script. The night before the gala, the bubble bursts. Her brother Danny calls a panic meeting. The second she walks into his apartment, he takes a baseball bat to her delusion. He slams the dirty bank receipts on the table, proving she sold her life to a mobster. All the air gets sucked out of Lena. The truth is a relentless hunter. No matter how deeply we bury our secrets beneath beautiful fantasies, the past always finds a way back to our doorstep. The explosive confrontation we have been waiting for is finally here. Danny is furious, shining a blinding spotlight on the ugly truth. He calls the Don exactly what he is, a ruthless mafia boss, and shreds his sister's martyr complex. And here is where human psychology gets terrifying. Instead of waking up, Lena goes to war for the villain. She weaponizes her own trauma, spinning her forced marriage into an epic win, because it paid for her brother's survival. She screams that she found something real hidden in that darkness. Watch her face right here. She actually believes it, and it is gut-wrenching to witness. A mind desperate to justify its own profound suffering will rewrite a horrific tragedy into a love story, simply because facing the cold reality makes it impossible to survive another day. You have to watch this brutal fight unfold. Danny stares at the exact dirty cash that kept him alive and totally snaps. He throws his words like daggers, screaming that his sister fell in love with the psycho who bought her. Look at Lena's body language. She shrinks down, yet fiercely defends her captor, claiming she really loves the monster. Danny yells that he would rather be dead than let her sacrifice her soul like this. Lena's face just shuts down completely. She delivers this cold comeback, whispering that she would rather have him breathing and hating her than buried 6 feet under. She backs out of the room just to keep her sanity intact. The lesson here is brutal. Human pride is a blinding condition. It rarely lets us appreciate the agonizing sacrifices others quietly endure for us. The camera follows Lena out to her car, and the second those doors lock, she totally breaks down. Heavy sobs rip through her body. And guess what kicks in? Her twisted dependency. Her hands shake uncontrollably as she dials Dante. The Don plays the ultimate white knight, sending his muscle to scoop her up. When she gets to him, she crashes right into his chest. It is a terrifying image, like a wounded bird crying in the arms of the exact hunter who shot it. She cries about Danny's harsh words, and Dante just strokes her hair, brushing off her brother's valid anger as foolish pride. He feeds her delusion, locking in her absolute reliance on his twisted world. The most dangerous manipulators never use heavy iron chains. They simply offer a comforting embrace exactly when you are falling. Let's open this file together, you and I, and look at the psychology of survival. Notice how Lena completely spins her own lies to stay afloat. She does not see herself as doing anything wrong. She thinks she is a superhero, protecting her brother. But look at the fragile bridge holding her sanity together. It is built entirely on Dante, the villain who started this nightmare. The camera watches her curl up against his side, begging for his touch just to stop her panic attack. It is the saddest trauma response ever. She is hiding from a tornado inside the exact same storm that wrecked her house. The lesson here hits hard. Human beings will almost always choose a familiar, warm danger over an unknown safety, happily rewriting their own moral compasses just to make it through the dark. Listen up, because this is where the chaos begins. We catch Lena staring into the mirror, putting on her lipstick like she is painting on war paint. She is building her mental armor before walking into a room full of high society sharks. Underneath that mask, her heart is hammering right out of her chest. Then Dante quietly slides in behind her, dropping his heavy hand onto her shoulder. Their eyes lock in the reflection. She is terrified this public stunt will destroy them both. But Dante, he is cold as ice. He whispers that playing the victim is just a slow death, handing her the ultimate hit of fake confidence. She takes it, borrowing his dark mob boss energy to survive the night. At the end of the day, we all put on a brave face to hide the scared kid inside, hoping the world falls for the illusion. Turn down the lights and listen close, because you and I need to dissect this quiet collision of souls. The ballroom is blinding flashbulbs exploding in a cold, artificial storm. In the center of it all stands Lena. She is trembling, her fingers digging into Dante's arm like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. Around them, the elite are watching with heavy judgment. Over in the shadows, Richard Blackwood raises a glass, a cruel smile cutting across his face. He thinks he holds the winning hand, but Dante does not flinch. He watches Blackwood with the calm certainty of a man who knows the trap is already sprung. It is a gentle reminder for our own lives. True power never has to shout in a crowded room. It just breathes softly in the dark and waits for the foolish to bury themselves. The heavy air in the room shatters when Dante steps to the microphone. He commands the space, his deep voice wrapping around the crowd. But then, without warning, he completely flips the script. He lays bare the cold terms of their fake 7-month marriage, his need for a pristine reputation, and her desperate need for survival money. The silence from the crowd is absolute. Then, his iron composure softens. He confesses, his voice thick with raw emotion, that this sterile contract somehow, he actually fell for her. He actually fell for her. It proves a beautiful, terrifying point about the human soul. We can build towering walls of steel to guard our feelings, but genuine love will always find the tiniest crack and bring the whole fortress tumbling down to the ground. Right there, in front of the city's ruthless elite, Dante metaphorically burns the very contract that brought them together. He laces his fingers through Lena's, forming an unbreakable front. When she takes the microphone, you can hear the aching vulnerability in her throat. She speaks of her brother, Danny, the crushing medical bills, and the sheer desperation that forced her hand. But as she turns to look at Dante, all that fear evaporates. Her eyes hold a fierce devotion. She admits to the world that a life without him is now unimaginable. She walked in as a sacrifice and stands tall a queen. It is a staggering display of loyalty that leaves us with a heavy truth. Sometimes, when life mercilessly backs you into a dark corner, you end up finding your truest sanctuary inside the exact cage that was designed to break you. The silence that follows is agonizing, pressing down like a physical weight. Not a soul breathes until Margaret Chen be thended to Clapham, and then the room erupts into thunderous noise. Blackwood stands frozen, his ultimate blackmail weapon turning to ash in his hands. Dante leans in, his breath warm against Lena's ear, whispering that they finally won. But deep inside, beneath the victory, Lena's heart races with terror. She just crossed a line she can never uncross. Playing a character was safe, but bleeding her actual truth out loud left her entirely exposed. It brings us to a harsh reality about our own lives. The most terrifying secrets are the ones we finally release. Once your deepest truth is breathing out in the open air, you can never force it back into the dark spaces it came from. Pushing through a sea of tailored suits, Lena feels a quiet shift in her soul. She realizes her chaotic love for Dante matters far more than the judgment of these hollow elites. But that warmth shatters when Blackwood deliberately blocks their escape. The man is decaying from the inside out, masking his bruised pride with an arrogant swagger. He spits poison, accusing Dante of spinning a pathetic sob story just to survive. It is tragic to watch. Just a cornered animal trying to bare its teeth at a lion. This quiet moment holds a profound lesson for us. When toxic people feel their control slipping, they will always try to convince you that your greatest strength is actually a fatal flaw, desperately hoping you will break before you realize how powerful you truly are. Dante does not even flinch. He stares Blackwood down with the freezing calm of a man who owns the night, reminding him that the truth requires no defense. Panicking, Blackwood pivots to Lena, dragging her crushing debts into the light. But Lena is magnificent. Swallowing her terror, she sets her jaw and dismantles his ego piece by piece, calling out his jealousy for what it is. Stripped of his power, Blackwood withers and retreats. Dante casts a look of disgust at the room before guiding Lena out into the cool air. The moment the car doors slam shut, Lena's armor dissolves. She begins to shake as the adrenaline crashes. It reveals a painful truth about human endurance. You only realize how utterly broken and exhausted you truly are the second you finally reach a place of undeniable safety. Back at the penthouse, the quiet is deafening. With the world locked outside, Dante reaches out, his rough hands incredibly gentle as he brushes a stray lock of hair from Lena's face. He murmurs that her fear was never a weakness, but the exact soil where her courage grew. Then the harsh glow of her phone shatters the intimacy. It is a message from Danny. Her brother saw the broadcast and demands answers. Lena is paralyzed by the thought that his love might turn to disgust. Dante gracefully steps back, giving her the space she needs to mend her fractured family alone. It brings us to an unavoidable reality. The betrayals that carve the deepest scars always come from the people who share our blood. But true healing can never begin until we step out of the shadows and face them. Stay with me, because you and I need to witness the raw humanity in this scene. Lena washes away the glamorous makeup until all that remains is a profoundly exhausted young woman. When Danny walks through the door, he looks hollowed out by grief. But the furious anger that once lived in his eyes is gone. His voice breaks as tears fall, apologizing for every cruel word he ever threw at her. He finally understands that she traded her own freedom to keep his heart beating in that hospital. He confesses that his fragile ego nearly destroyed the person who fought for him. It is a quiet, powerful lesson in redemption. If we truly want to heal a broken relationship, we have to completely shatter our own pride and acknowledge the agonizing sacrifices someone else made for us in the dark. Lena is trembling, crushed by the guilt of deceiving him for months. Danny steps close, gripping her shoulders to steady her. He reminds her she was always his protector, and no lie could ever change that truth. Taking a shaky breath, Lena delivers her heaviest confession. She whispers that the cold arranged marriage to a crime boss has blossomed into a terrifying, all-consuming love. Danny searches her exhausted face, finds only pure honesty, and pulls her into a fierce embrace. He vows their family tie can weather any storm. Then his tone drops, deadly serious, demanding to know if Dante truly honors her. It is a profound reminder for us all. The most beautiful relationships we ever forge are exactly the ones strong enough to survive our darkest mistakes and our deepest betrayals. The heavy tension shatters when Danny lets out a rough laugh, swearing to bury Dante if the mafia boss ever causes her pain. It is a sweet attempt to reclaim his role as protector. They spend hours unpacking the chaotic maze her life has become. But when Danny mentions the looming expiration date on her marriage contract, the warmth leaves Lena's body. She freezes, haunted by the fear that Dante still views her as a mere business transaction. Danny leans in, refusing to let her spiral. He tells her she cannot survive in the shadows of assumptions. It's a piece of wisdom we all need to hold on to. Assuming the worst will slowly rot your peace of mind. We suffer infinitely more in the silent agony of our own fearful imagination than we ever do by simply standing up and demanding the hard truth. The silent drive back is an agonizing crawl. Streetlights wash over Lena's face, mirroring her inner turmoil. She is tormented by her love for a man who purchased her time. Inside the dark office, Dante stands like a rigid statue by the window. She whispers that her brother is safe, but Dante's reply is like cracked ice. Without turning, he flatly reminds her that their contract expires in 5 months. The words strike her chest like a heavy blow. Fierce anger takes over, and she demands to know if their romance is just a waiting room for a bitter end. Dante slowly turns, the air between them turning electric. It is a brutal reminder. Hiding behind a wall of silence never protects you. It only guarantees a much more devastating explosion when the hidden truth finally forces its way out. Step closer, because you and I are about to witness a masterclass in emotional warfare. Lena refuses to back down. She stares right through Dante, violently tearing the bandage off their arrangement to demand the truth. Right before our eyes, the untouchable mafia boss begins to fracture. A man who commands the underworld shrinks back, throwing up logical excuses to mask his suffocating fear of abandonment. He claims he wants to give her a clean exit, but it is a coward's defense. When powerful people feel exposed, they wield cold logic as a shield. Lena refuses to let him hide, pushing him to the absolute edge. It is a profound wake-up call. Those heavy steel walls we construct to protect our fragile emotions are usually the exact things locking us inside a painfully lonely prison. The air grows thin as Lena completely rewrites their power dynamic. She stands toe-to-toe with a lethal crime boss, demanding he tear up the contract binding her to his dark world. And the shocking part? Dante flinches. The hardened king of the streets is paralyzed by his own terror, convinced his toxic existence will eventually ruin her. It is a psychological trap we see every day. We constantly push away the people closest to us out of the sheer panic that they might decide to leave us first. Lena holds an unforgiving mirror to his damaged soul, forcing him to own his own chaos. Finally, his iron mask shatters. He steps into her spaces, his voice a low, desperate growl vowing that he will never let her walk away. It launches them into the most beautifully dangerous standoff of their entire lives. Let's turn the lights down low for a second, you and I. The Ice King finally shatters. Dante drops his bulletproof posture, and you can practically hear the exhaustion rattling in his chest. Under those dim lights, panic flashes in his dark eyes as he spills his deepest secret. He admits he has pictured her walking out that door 1,000 times, trying to callous his heart for the inevitable bleed. To hear a man who built a ruthless empire confess he would be a hollow shell without her, it is staggering. Lena sees right through it. They are both using cold math to dodge the terrifying reality of real love. But here is the hard truth we all learn eventually. You simply cannot negotiate your way out of a human emotion. Stop the math, Dante, and just beg her to stay. The frequency of the room shifts as Lena crosses her point of no return. She stares at the absolute wreckage of his mafia lifestyle and decides to dive into the dark anyway, leaving her quiet dreams behind. Dante reaches into his coat, his hand visibly trembling, and pulls out the contract. By offering up that paper, the most dangerous man in the city surrenders his leverage. The sound of him tearing it to shreds echoes like a gunshot. It is a terrifying move. But sometimes the most meaningful step forward requires destroying the exact safety nets we worked so incredibly hard to build. The ripped pages drift down like dirty snow. The business deal is dead. Now, they are just two tragic souls completely consumed by one another. They crash into each other in the shadows, Dante clinging to her like a drowning man. He is begging to be treated like a flesh and blood guy for once, rather than an untouchable mob boss. Lena whispers that she is ready to tear down whatever walls he has left. But then the morning sun breaks, dragging a nightmare straight to their door. Their quiet sanctuary gets nuked when a viral leak of their confession floods the streets, shattering his reputation as a cold-blooded killer. It is a bitter reality check. True intimacy is incredibly fragile, and there is always a crowd waiting to weaponize our most private truths for cheap entertainment. Lena can only stare in horror as her phone lights up the nightstand. The street war has officially begun. The camera pushes right into Lena's face. She is completely shell-shocked by this blinding spotlight. Going from a whispered midnight confession to a public gasping for air, in seconds leaves her gasping for a heavy knock kills the silence, and Vincent strolls in looking like the Grim Reaper. He drops a bomb from the syndicate board. To these ruthless men, catching feelings is a terminal disease. Half the crew thinks Dante went soft, while the rest are sweating bullets. A massive trial is looming. In the shadows, Richard Blackwood is grinning like a shark that just smelled blood. Listen to the brutal lesson here. In any cutthroat hierarchy, showing your heart is exactly like baring your throat to a pack of starving wolves. Blackwood is finally making his deadly move. Vincent paces the hardwood, his voice dropping 10 degrees as he hands Lena her impossible new role. Playing the innocent girlfriend is off the table. She has to harden into an absolute weapon. Her worth is now just a cold statistic to prove to a room of gangsters that she brings value to the empire. She must put her own beating heart on trial to save Dante from a bullet. The second Vincent leaves, Dante completely shape-shifts. The soft lover vanishes, and the hollow-eyed demon of the underworld snaps right back into place. His survival mindset is chilling. Guilt is the most useless emotion on the planet when your house is burning down around you. You cannot cry over the match. You just have to grab a bucket and extinguish the flames. The ruthless general is back. Dante pulls off a retaliation that is pure calculated genius. Instead of hiding her, he drags Lena straight into the sniper's sights, tying their fates so intimately that anyone shooting at her has to go through his chest first. The heavy vault doors swing open, Litfiti staring them down like starving bosses, staring them down starving sharks. Blackwood is sitting there, tasting early victory. But Dante is absolute stone, no begging, no sweating. He just violently slams a mountain of financial ledgers right onto the mahogany table. It is a savage but brilliant life lesson. When you are dealing with absolutely heartless people, you have to speak the only language they actually care about. He crushes their fake moral outrage with pure, undeniable profit. Then comes the wildest psychological flex of Dante's life. He takes a step back into the shadows, leaving Lena alone in the center of this mafia firing squad. You could hear a pin drop as 15 stone-cold killers lock their dead eyes on her. But her hands do not even shake. She trashes the fairy tale romance angle and flat out admits that she was bought and paid for. That savage, unblinking honesty entirely wrecks Blackwood's argument. She spins Dante's obsession not as a fatal weakness, but as a violent upgrade, making him 1,000 times more lethal. We need to frame this lesson. When you face down enemies praying for your ruin, the most terrifying weapon you can ever draw is the raw, unpolished truth. She proves the hostage just evolved into a queen. The meeting erupts into a psychological brawl. Richard jumps up, spitting venom, trying to convince the room that a boss in love is a dead man walking. But Lena steps right up into his personal space, totally shattering his psychopath logic. She fires back that having nothing to lose makes a man sloppy, but finding someone worth dying for turns his chest into a titanium vault. She reminds these monsters that a predator always hesitates when the prey is ready to drag them to the graveyard. In the corner, Vincent is smirking like a proud father. Dante is just staring at her like she is magic. Remember this energy. Standing your ground in a room full of monsters is not just brave. It is a bloody, necessary demand for your own right to exist. The final votes drop with the cold energy of a grim reaper. 10-5. Dante keeps his bloody crown, and Richard is permanently dragged into the dark. The absolute second those heavy penthouse doors lock behind them, Dante's steel spine turns to jelly. The untouchable Dawn totally crashes, burying his face into her shoulder, physically shaking from the insane stress of almost losing his world. Lena holds him tight, fully aware they both wear concrete masks out there just to hide their screaming anxiety. The months slowly bleed into a shaky, quiet peace. Lena returns to the hospital, balancing saving lives with loving a mafia king. Here is the real lesson. True resilience is keeping your hands perfectly steady even when your soul is completely terrified of what happens tomorrow. You and I have finally made it to the quiet eye of this beautifully toxic storm. Beneath the mafia drama, they actually find a genuine groove. We are talking slow coffee dates and spilling secrets under the covers. A year flies by and Dante looks at her with a face that finally forgot how to scowl. He confesses his biggest crime. His master scheme to lock her in a cage was actually the only thing that rescued his soul. She became the brightest light in his dark world, curing decades of lonely misery. Lena just smiles softly and touches his face. It is the ultimate human irony. We spend our energy building massive emotional fortresses to block out the pain, only to realize we are dying to be saved by the exact vulnerability we try so hard to escape. Picture this dark setup. The ballroom is dripping in golden light, and we are watching the ultimate psychological plot twist go down. Dante is running this second wedding like he is directing a tragic mob movie, spinning their forced deal into romantic destiny. He has his heavy hitters standing quiet while he drops vows about choosing her every single day. It is a boss move, but deeply toxic. Lena is actually shaking at the altar. Tears fall as she hands over the last piece of her free will, openly declaring her devotion. She walks right into the cage and clicks the lock shut herself. It is wild to witness, but the lesson is very real. The absolute hardest prisons to ever break out of are the emotional deals we willingly make with the exact people holding us down. Look closely at this final frame. Lena whispers that she chooses him. Those words hit like a truck, rebooted her trauma into a twisted romance. They kiss in the shadows. locking the door on a psychological grave she honestly believes is a honeymoon suite. Meanwhile, her brother Danny is fading out in the background, her last tie to normal reality slipping away. And Dante? He is resting in his wheelchair, looking like a mafia shadow king on a leather throne. His terrifying is secure, but his most terrifying flex is having this woman willingly on her knees in front of him. The final lesson is brutal but true. People will gladly swallow a sweet, comforting lie every single time if facing the ugly truth means shattering their own hearts. 3 years slip by like rain down Ocañado, and the atmosphere in that mansion heavy. Lena no longer flinches at the muffled violence echoing through the walls. To survive sleeping beside a predator, she tells herself his rare warmth outweighs the bodies buried in his name. Look at Dante, staring into the dark, casually mentioning Marcus Chen. He brings up the very man whose blood paid for their bond, wondering if that ghost would bless them. He is using a tragedy he caused to water the roots of his twisted romance. It is agonizing psychological manipulation. We have to understand a harsh truth here. The most dangerous people do not just ruin your present. They dig into your deepest wounds, twisting your reality until you are simply too exhausted to ever walk away. Watch the calculated way Dante pulls her onto his lap. It looks like a tender embrace, but that grip around her waist is pure iron. He leans in, breath warm against her neck, whispering that real trust does not need paper contracts. Just the two of them choosing each other every day. And just like that, he burns the agreement. He knows he has already built an inescapable cage deep inside her mind. The saddest part is watching Lena smile, completely unaware of the dark tragedy she is living in. She truly believes she is free. It leaves us with a devastating life lesson. When a toxic force slowly drains away all your power, you will eventually start polishing your own chains. You will call it a beautiful transformation just to survive the crushing reality of being totally helpless. You and I need to look closely at how this emotional abuse takes hold. The estate reeks of violence, yet Lena closes her eyes to the bloodshed, pretending she is not resting her head against a killer. Her brother Danny desperately begs her to wake up. He warns that this illusion of freedom is just a painted movie set hiding a concrete cell. But she turns away from her own blood, desperate to believe love can blossom from sheer extortion. It is a terrifying display of psychological conditioning. It brings us to a painful truth about human nature. The hardest traps to break free from are never made of solid steel. They are the beautiful fake realities we construct in our own minds, just so we can feel loved by the very monster holding the key. It is heartbreaking to watch her lean into his chest, genuinely believing this hostage situation is a romance. 3 years have erased the sweet nurse she used to be. Now, she exists only as a perfectly molded shadow. Dante tilts her chin up, the cold, calculating gears turning behind his eyes. He has the nerve to ask if she has any regrets. Fully knowing he was the one who reprogrammed her mind, she gives him a shattered smile and swears she has none. She happily traded a safe life for a high-end nightmare. This is a lesson we all need to remember. True evil rarely kicks down your door wearing a terrifying mask. It sneaks inside wearing a tailored suit, pulling you into a warm embrace, and softly whispering that surviving trauma together is what true love feels like. As the scene fades to black, we witness a tragic masterclass in manipulation. The boss has consumed his prize. Lena stands there like a queen, convinced that staying was her own choice. She looks at the blood spilled for them, and her hijacked mind only sees romantic rose petals. The dark transaction that bought her is gone, replaced by loyalty to the man who trapped her. No fight remains in her spirit. No tears, no plans to run. just the deafening silence of a broken soul. Think about this as our final chilling life lesson. The ultimate victory for a predator is never using physical force to keep you. It is patiently waiting in the dark until you fall madly, unconditionally in love with the cage itself.